On Truth-Telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 32. Briefly on Feminism. There were those essays I wrote where I grappled with feminism in one way or another. I wanted to squarely confront it and show at the same time that I could wrestle it to the ground. The figure of wrestling is apt, because the intellectual or ideological side of me was never far from the fantasy of raping or being raped. Oh, to think that power and sex can be distinguished so easily. Not only was every living fiber of me proof to the contrary, but there was every living Helen with her power to draw 1,000 looks. Viewed by me as a great propagandistic lie, I detested the feminist line on power. I didn't believe that the latest squabbles between men and women and the rewriting of old wrongs justified it. And when I went about the business of studying feminism and feminist critique, it was less with the desire to identify with people fighting for an equal playing field than to know the enemy. Of course I know the essays he's talking about. They're not so sensational as all that. In fact, it's all quite misleading because he never wrote specifically on feminism. It was mostly stuff that came out when he was examining the feminist critiques of works like Paradise Lost, Beowulf, and the Battle of Maldon. We're committed to telling the truth here. Alright, the one on the Battle of Maldon got a bit out of hand. The professor reprimanded him for being too harsh and cutting. Professor Isodorczyk, although sympathetic to your main argument, I think the tone of your paper is not entirely appropriate. He was criticizing the critic, Heather Stewart, because she herself was criticizing the heroic ideal in the Battle of Maldon and making it out to be the cause of wars and suffering. Didn't she have a point? Well, maybe a little one, but she pumped it up so much she was ready to turn the usual interpretation of the poem upside down. But one might say she had courage to do what she did. In fact, one might say she acted heroically. That's a point he raised with himself later. And probably thinking he was also scoring a point for himself. After all, it's a way to complicate heroism. On the other hand, she was focusing on one end of it. The business of going to war and killing people. So maybe she had in mind something else. Yes, the warrior ideal. But then it seems to me this ideal would either have to be understood as limited to the battlefield or else the heroic ideal kept out of all human conflict. After all, if it were allowed to assert itself in some part of it, why exclude it from others? It would have to be applied only to things like saving people. Then everybody's on board about who's a hero and who's not. But when it comes to killing them, it's always split between those who see a glorious battle and those who see the most horrible crimes. It seems to me if the heroic is to be held responsible for wars and suffering, it must be eliminated not only on the battlefield but in the boardroom. Mixing sexuality with sexual politics even got into my interpretation of Beowulf. The Egoism, fighting in her own element, becomes a far greater threat to Beowulf than her son ever was. Greater physical strength no longer is the deciding factor in battle and, as a glorified male attribute, becomes a thing of mockery for the warrior woman who is willing to exploit every advantage. The equalization of the contest between them results in a prolonged seesaw battle fought at close quarters. There is the tussling for a dominant or favorable position, the Egoism finally sitting on the hero and trying to penetrate his armor first with her fingers and then with her knife. His thesis was that there's a dialectic in Beowulf between one type of woman and another. A kind like me, say, for instance, and a monster type. And the monster type is outside nature and society, which of course means male-dominated society, and so is very fearful and even emasculating. I must confess I did get a fright when I heard it suggested in class that most anonymous writings of the past were written by women. Or that men had created a patriarchal god in order to put down the threat that the opposite sex posed to them. Or that male authors were guilty of sexism every time they depicted an unflattering female character or let some male character give vent to his misogynist feelings. No doubt my reaction was a typically neurotic one that sprang from largely unexamined assumptions about male superiority. At the same time I was acutely aware that correcting past injustices was not the same as being just. If ever I was one who could have been labeled a misogynist, it was at least partly for the reason that I resented being so labeled and the all too quick use of labels in general. It seems to me the phenomenon of feminism in the university cannot be treated so lightly without stifling one of the important voices that should be brought in here. That poses a problem for me because I can't be that voice or take on a way of thinking that, though it may suit some, would not suit me. Of course you're cut from a different cloth. But I was wondering why he hadn't got someone to take on the role. I suppose I could do it in a pinch. No, no, no. What is needed is a genuine voice. Not a caricature. How would such a voice sound? Would it chide him for taking up the subject as he does? For letting it be fueled by an all too masculine and even hyper-masculine identity? Would it denounce him for not turning his project into a self-condemnation, an admission of its being grounded in a long tradition of wrongdoing? That's the way most of us are made to feel. The collective guilt thing. Why shouldn't it be admitted as true? Who is denying the truth and who is, and on what authority demanding it to be the whole truth? The masculinists on one side and the feminists on the other. And to be neither, I think, is to find the whole of it a caricature of the struggle between the sexes, because it's the mere politics or policy of stigmatizing the opposing party while viewing. I'm sorry, I do tend to go on. On truth-telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 33. On getting personal. It was while taking these honors courses that the thought first struck me that I could have been a father to many of my fellow students. Notwithstanding this source of both minor amazement and discomfort, I was still very much at an age, but will I ever be past this age, that I would have liked to have had sex with a few of them. This certainly doesn't sound like someone who's left behind masculinism. On the contrary, he seems to be giving reason to those who've long denounced men for viewing women as sex objects. As it so happened, one of the young ladies to whom I was attracted was both an ardent feminist and a lesbian. She and the young woman who was her lover often took umbrage at my comments, though our exchanges thankfully fell short of nastiness, in a course on American literature that was focused on opening up the canon to Hispanic, Afro-American, and women writers. Of course, I never made any advances towards her, but rather argued with her and her friend in class while secretly admiring her. My sexual love was this show of mastery that from time to time dismayed me because it seemed as sterile as some might have judged the love between these young women. And what about the love between men? Why hasn't he dealt with that if his purpose is to confront his subject from all angles? Of course, I now take comfort in the thought that both sterility and fruitfulness can take many forms. Sterility, as much as anything can be called sterile in human affairs, may very well be the seedbed of diverse spiritual children. If I look into my own heart, I see that I was always more interested in being a progenitor of these. No doubt the course of my life and many of my actions have been influenced by this preference. All the heartache notwithstanding, I was at bottom someone who could stand alone and, with a combination of sporadic sexual encounters and erotic fantasies, carve out of my solitude an idealized love and destiny. It's still not clear why he treats heterosexuality with less degree of, if I may say so, heterogeneity than other subjects. Which of course could also be called an unabashed and unrelenting self-love. Do you think he could deal with it as you might wish, that is, politically, and not be counterfeiting? Especially when you see me here looking as I am, which is not exactly dowdy. You're voluptuous. If you had a man who looked exactly like me, if his voice were like mine, and if he acted pretty much like I do you know what you'd have? You'd have all my hero's homosexuality coming out of the closet. My wife-daughter fantasy effectively ruled out any desire for a so-called normal relationship with women. And my preoccupation with my past self did the same for begetting children. Of course, all of this must be taken in the light of never having met the right woman when I was young. But, then again, who would have fit the bill except some flesh and blood goddess who, Athena-like, would have been forever behind me? Is it part of our task to get personal? To lay bare our souls? Aren't we here simply to flesh out the subjective and objective poles of truth-telling? You on one side, me on the other. You the temptation, make-believe, passion, and high feeling that go with it. Me the nastiness, swordplay, criticism, and so on. I'm not jealous or upset by what he said beyond a certain point. I'm not scandalized either by erotic elements that have a lot to do with what I'm all about. Instead, I take it as the greatest compliment that I, Alice, a simple undergraduate student, am the flesh and blood realization of what was only fantasy in him before. After all, it's me who can say she's the princess who's finally come into his life and not only declared herself to be passionately in love with him but actively behind him. I have had to live with the sterility of being an onanist and a narcissist all my life. I have had to bear it as much as any person has to put up with being a soul tethered to an asshole. That's a fine line. It is not so easy to call oneself an asshole when others may very well be tempted to. It's from one of Irving Layton's poems. When I look back on all my passions and rages. I said it was a fine line. I know that, as much they issued forth not in private but in public, I always viewed them as well-grounded, as reasonable, as justified, as the mark of my solid, straightforward, and even heroic character. It was always others who, in offensive, treacherous, or thoughtless ways, set a light to the explosive charge that was in me and who received, as a consequence, their due. On the other hand, how many times have I gone in for self-laceration, for calling myself an asshole, for ranting and raving over my foolishness and ineptness in the quiet of a room? What a gap there is between a public and a private persona, between maintaining a good opinion of oneself for others to pick up on and scrapping it entirely in order to be the sternest of judges. I must say, I'm warming to his candor. So much in us is divided and hidden away that, if it weren't for efforts of this sort, we'd take it for granted that formality in our lives was the highest achievement. On Truthtelling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 34. Formalism. It boils down to this: fighting for the freedom to choose what forms to go with and what forms to reject. To being a bit more passionate about this struggle and this freedom than the vast majority of people. Straight formality was always something I tried to subvert in my essay so that there might be at least some acknowledgement of irreducibly personal factors. Because I was quite conscious of having limited knowledge in many and indeed most areas, any attempt to repress these elements would have struck me as merely taking advantage of a certain licensed deception. Then as now, I took it that there was an implicit understanding amongst truth-tellers that, although each and everyone spoke as if he were the voice of reason itself, which I take to be the scholarly style, this was a mere formality that didn't imply that anyone thought he actually was free of all internal or external influences. But along with this was the implication, and this was what struck me as the ongoing deception, that these influences were only accidental. Or, at best, mistakes to be overcome that provided a pathway to some higher and indeed highest understanding. Attacking formality is a tricky business. You can hardly dispense with it, I mean the formality and not the attacking, if you're ever to get beyond mere opinion and prejudice. And of course I don't mean in any absolute sense. I mean relative to what is today mere opinion and prejudice. Pathways to a higher if not highest understanding cannot be treated as mere deception, because then there would be no reason to climb out of the caves of ourselves and seek the light of truth and knowledge. It seems the difficulty I have always been wrestling with in this essay is this thinking of truth-telling as the most rarefied deception and self-deception. So rarefied in fact that it stretches out of sight as truth and knowledge. So rarefied again that it converts all eternity into a human habitat with forever a backyard and a field to investigate. And so rarefied once more that it can't be argued with, done away with, or distinguished from all that we labor for or labor with. So much is it the character and constitution of truth-telling that sometimes it seems that it is the whole of it. After all, what else might there be but some thought that doubles back on these other thoughts, these monumental ones, and, in the very name of truth-telling itself, doubts their authenticity? Someone thought out of 100 perhaps. Someone thought that is erratic, out of order, and not contributing anything to truth-telling except a certain radical idealization of it. Oh, this difficulty that comes from having at least 99 thoughts out of 100 bent against it. From having 99 thoughts out of 100 squarely keeping faith with truth, reason, and the idea of one final reckoning. Here of course I'm no different from others, or at least no different from them other than by being a bit more constant and persistent in holding on to that one thought out of 100 that eludes membership. That one thought that speaks of a truth beyond all that can bear this name, but that, as much as this thought can touch or include it, speaks more truthfully than the 99 thoughts that range themselves otherwise. Alice, you look like a girl who's just joined a religious cult. On Truth-telling. A demonstration of the inseparability of truth from the telling of it. By Michael E. Hunter. 35. Egoism. I decided at the beginning that telling the truth about myself had to be one with telling the truth about truth-telling. I took it to be significant right away that there would be an irreducible element of self-promotion. Of taking the best view of myself. Of letting my egoism be part and parcel of the very attempt to tell the truth about it. Perhaps not fully realized then was that putting all this on display and objectifying it could extend even to creating and falling in love with a Pygmalion-like self-image. Falling in love with what in effect is being born in and born by this project, I should almost say, as one putting his ego on display, born out, and is both a projection of my past life into the present and my present life into the past. An indissociably aesthetic and ethical project that makes all the weakness and ugliness in this past and present life seem redeemable, necessary, transfigured as the constituents of a growing perfection. Such then is the redoubtable reaction to and overcoming of the self-contempt and self-dissatisfaction that has both spurred and scalded me throughout all my adolescent and adult years. Indeed, it was this negative side of self-examination and self-evaluation that started off this essay and then, due to what I just called, or, should I say, justly called the redoubtable reaction to and overcoming of it, was immediately subjugated and taken over by the task of redeeming my past life by transforming my present one into its completion and consummation. So much then are these two attitudes bound together, like a wanderer and his shadow, and wherever the one seems to be solely in evidence, it is but the other in a state of total or near total eclipse. A transitory enough affair that I hardly would wish to do away with if I'm to continue the task of trying to make my egoism one with telling the truth about it. Therefore attention must be kept between what I want to bring forth as a full manifestation of it and what I must recognize. How else could there be this full manifestation, as related tricks, games, subterfuge, and the like? So far it has been a seesaw battle with my ego, sometimes resembling a balloon about to burst and sometimes a pin that preemptively pricks and deflates it. If he continues in this vein, I won't play the curmudgeon. I'll even congratulate him. I'm certainly not against exploring the self and exposing our prejudices. In fact, that's the best way to make our conversation go beyond polemics and become a transfiguring experience. But perhaps creating and falling in love with a Pygmalion-like self-image should not be thought of as being limited to one essay or the work of one essay or the work of an essay called On Truth-Telling. The work of this essay, that is the attempt to take the whole of my life beyond the ordinary and unexceptional, cannot be separated from the life that was often the rough, vague, imprecise, ambiguous effort to do just the same. Nor can it be dissociated from the view that this final wrap-up essay, this most Pygmalion-like one called On Truth-Telling, is not some mere addition to it but the natural outgrowth of a long period of development, struggle, and the like that might also be called, in a both strict and not so strict sense, a long series of essays. Nor from the view that, had I not been lucky enough to reach this wrap-up essay, I would have fallen short of reaching the stage of development where I could push my highest branches beyond the surrounding forest of truth-tellers. What I think of as my self-love, my creating and falling in love with a Pygmalion-like self-image would have run its course without ever having reached the point of articulating itself as this design and end. Speaking from the depths of this same self-love, I hold that it is no mere narcissism. Rather, I'm driven with all that self-love can be as self-respect and self-engagement to articulate it as the most rarefied deception and self-deception. It is indistinguishable from telling the truth as the complication and even overcomplication of truth-telling. He's walking a tightrope over many things. But if he has good faith and generosity of spirit behind him, I'm sure he'll be able to stay on and get to the other side. I suppose that from the very moment I imagined myself becoming a great spirit in some definite and yet still vague and uncertain enough way, definite in the sense of aiming high and vague and uncertain in the sense of what this would lead to, I was committed to a self-image that itself was a commitment to hard paths and highest objectives. Winning popularity or having tremendous ability was never the highest goal for me because it didn't involve the deepest or most comprehensive commitment. With such an outlook, I must have had planted in me at an early age the thought that failing greatly was preferable to succeeding without greatness. At least I'm inclined to believe this was so and see evidence of it in the fact that, later on in life, I remained tied to the idea of becoming a great writer when, after having determined I was fit for nothing better, I was given good reason to think I wasn't fit for it at all. To be sure, the university essays were something of an exception. Generally speaking, they gladdened my heart, brought me good tidings, and pointed towards some possibility of entering, or, if I gave my imagination full rein, exploding, onto the literary scene. Even with the shift towards studying philosophy as well as literature, I continued to believe that everything was grist for the writer's mill and that there was always the possibility of being swept up by some future inspiration, or rather wave of inspirations, that would put to use everything I had ever done or thought. Looking back, I find a certain degree of clarity and precision in striving so disjointedly for some major success. For deferring it as a direct course or well-defined route. For finding faith and optimism even while feeling that I was simply plodding along. For when all is said and done, the university essays I wrote never forsook their status as assignments, never transformed themselves except for fleeting moments into wonderfully wrought treatises, and never were more than little scholarly efforts that could easily have lost themselves amongst better attired and more privileged ones. My awareness of this was troubling to the extent that, by not extending myself beyond this limited domain, I sensed some lack of resolve, some inner poverty, some all too scattered and heterogeneous orientation. Indeed, It was this problem of orientation I always felt, because at the heart of my erratic flight was less a practical than idealistic bent, less the need to be clear on where I was headed than to be clean on what I was doing. An untroubled intellectual conscience is what I gave highest priority to, and, with respect to writing university essays and all that may have troubled it, I was never so troubled as to renounce it as a trustworthy guide. I sometimes wish he'd fall off the rope,